Hello folks, and welcome back to another episode of Monday Rules. And before I get started on this week's episode, first I'd like to provide you with some updates. So as some of you are aware, I have been away at TwitchCon for the last couple of days. That means that I haven't got around to sending out the emails for the 25k subscriber giveaway. So for those of you who've been patiently waiting for those emails, don't worry, I'll be getting them out within the next 24 hours or so. So hang tight, they are coming. There are other people who are probably wondering, well, did you manage to talk to the producers at Wargaming this time when you went? Were you able to give them feedback or anything like that? I will probably cover all that stuff tomorrow in a Sale and Chat episode, because today, obviously, with Monday Rules, it's always the focus on the person who actually sent in the replay. So let's meet our winner from last week's contest, and the winner is RUMIRUMI from the European server. And Rumi is using armor piercing only on a St. Louis. And the reason why I set out this challenge is because there's so many people at the lower tiers, at like tier 3, who do nothing but shoot HE, when something like AP can be so much more useful on so many more occasions. In this particular engagement that's going to happen next, Rumi is engaging a Tenryu. Watch the difference between what normally would happen if you were using HE and using AP. Look at the amount of HP that gets wiped out if you're able to hit the citadels on these lightly armored cruisers at the lower tiers. It's like in 2 salvos you can wipe out pretty much all of their HP. The St. Louis actually benefits quite a bit from shooting armor piercing. Why? Because it can actually fire a lot of shells. I mean, at the lower tiers, it's probably got the most amount of guns per broadside once you get the upgraded hull, that your AP salvos can do a lot of damage. Furthermore, the St. Louis has another advantage. It's able to actually go broadside to broadside against most other cruisers without worry, because the St. Louis's armor is quite thick. And that means that against the Japanese guns, for example, even if the Japanese 140mm guns do fire armor piercing, they don't really have a chance of penetrating St. Louis. They kind of have to depend on their torpedoes. So the St. Louis is really able to get into its ideal kind of situations when fighting enemy ships. And if you're running up against cruisers at lower tiers, you can pretty much stomp them with APs to their citadel areas. Against battleships, AP, while not at times as good as HE, can still do quite a bit of damage, because just penetrating hits is still enough to hurt battleships. And at the lower tiers, battleships don't exactly have a lot of HP to be taking those hits. So even if you just fire nothing but AP, you can still do good damage against enemy ships. So what about destroyers? Because people are like, well, destroyers get overpenned. Well, low tier destroyers don't have a lot of HP. And even if you only take 10% of the shell's citadel damage, during overpens, you can still take a bunch of damage, like over 1,000 if the enemy St. Louis can land 4 hits, which really, with the number of guns that the St. Louis has, that is no problem at all. In fact, the only ships I would really be concerned with as an AP firing St. Louis would really be battleships and other St. Louis's, and that's because I mentioned earlier the St. Louis itself has really thick armor and isn't exactly the easiest thing to citadel. So even if you watch this particular engagement here that Rumi's having with the enemy St. Louis here, you'll see that the armor piercing is able to get reasonable penetration damage, but no real luck on getting anything more than that. Battleships, on the other hand, well, I mean, unless you get them on the broadside and you fire at them, generally speaking, battleships aren't exactly the easiest things to kill when you're firing AP out of a St. Louis. Although, pretty much any other things, like tier 5 cruisers even, like think about the Omaha or the Furutaka, even those ships would be in trouble when up against a St. Louis. The Omaha more so, the Furutaka can be a little bit more annoying in a St. Louis because, its guns are a little bit bigger and it can hurt you, but I mean, against tier 3s, it's no contest. The St. Louis is pretty much able to take care of itself without issues, and as you can tell, the enemy Tenryu here is just taking a beating from Rumi and the AP that he's able to fire. That's one of the things about the low tier Japanese cruisers, is that they're nice because you're fast, but dear lord, when you run up against somebody who knows what they're doing with armor piercing, your game could just end within a few minutes. I mean, you could just get in there, run into someone who knows what they're doing, and you could just die. Now, the St. Louis does have its flaws. I mean, I'm not saying the ship is perfect. The St. Louis is really slow, which can be detrimental. However, if you play it on certain maps, like for example this particular map, Islands, where everything is a close-in brawl pretty much, then the St. Louis's most obvious weak point, its poor speed, is somewhat negated because you're able to get into range of just about anything you want to shoot at in a reasonable amount of time. By this time in the battle, Rumi has pretty much carried his entire team. 6 kills, 12 citadels, a lot of good things done already. But there's still 2 enemy ships, so first, before engaging the 2 enemy ships or going off to find them, Rumi does actually do the good thing and he caps 1 cap. This means that now, unless the enemy team decides to cap the 3rd one, if they leave it like this, then they're not going to gain any advantages from the caps. They're just going to have to kill the ships off. And right now, Rumi's team is at an advantage. Well, the enemy battleship is too far away, and the enemy cruiser is closer. So, of course, the first target is actually going to be that cruiser. Now, watch this. This is the thing about St. Louis and St. Louis combat, is that sometimes, if the enemy St. Louis just angles a little bit, they do have the potential of negating your damage. However, at this particular time, a lot of people might just say, okay, well, I'm going to switch over to high explosive because it's going to allow me to do more consistent damage. Well, that's not necessarily true, because if you can aim it at certain areas of the ship that are not as well protected, you can still do pretty good penetration damage. So as you can tell, each salvo there in the last one was doing somewhere in the range of like 3,000 plus damage, which at this particular tier, again, take 3,000 to 4,000 damage per salvo and you're losing sizable chunks of your HP. And of course, finally, there is 3 ships on Rumi's team against only a sole battleship, and of course, this battle is eventually won by Rumi's team. So let's see how he actually did, and let's see the winning amount of damage that he was able to put out using only armor piercing on a St. Louis. So the battle was a victory. Rumi's team managed to win that battle, and Rumi managed to score 3,519 experience, getting high caliber Confederate 206,000 credits, which is phenomenal. 185 hits total, 6 ships sunk, 12 citadels hit. Managed to also cap the base one. So that is fantastic work in a St. Louis, and also just shows you that an AP St. Louis is perfectly viable at the lower tiers. In terms of damage output, Rumi was able to manage 90,928 damage with armor piercing alone, which is mind-boggling because there are a lot of people out there who will struggle to get up to this amount of damage, even with things like battleships, never mind something like a St. Louis. So, Rumi, congratulations. Keep your eye open on your email. I'll be sending you some doubloons on the EU server. So enjoy those, and let's move on to this week's Monday Rules Challenge. And the challenge for this week is for you to go out there, play your Tirpitzes or Torpitzes. Anyhow, go play your Tirpitzes, use your torpedoes, get as much torpedo and flooding damage as humanly possible. You can use your guns, but I will not count that damage. No other restrictions, max torpedo and flooding damage wins. So get out there, have some fun, and remember folks, Monday rules.